Well, welcome one and all. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on the time zone from which you're dialing in. Thrilled to have you all on board for what I know is going to be a terrific conversation with three esteemed panelists whom I'll introduce in a little bit. My name is Wyne. I'm the Senior Research and Advocacy Advisor for U.S. China Relations here at the International Crisis Group. I want to thank a couple of colleagues, Teresa and Michelle. You can't see them, but as is so often the case with events, it's often the people you can't see on screen who make the magic happen. So I want to thank Teresa and Michelle for their help in organizing this event. Just a couple of housekeeping notes, or a few housekeeping notes, and then we'll dive into the conversation. The first is that this event, it is being live streamed. For folks who can't join, there will also be a recording available later. Secondly, the four of us who you see on screen will be speaking for about 45 minutes, just having a conversation. Then we'll have 30 minutes for questions from all of you. So as you're listening to the conversation, if an inspiration strikes, if you have a question, please feel free to input it into the Q&A box. I'll get to as many of them as I can during that second part of the event, which will take place for about 30 minutes. And then the third note, I would be remiss not to note, one of the impetuses for this event, it's a report that the International Crisis Group published last month called The Next U.S. Administration and China Policy. And what this report attempted to do was to contrast how a second Trump administration and a Harris administration would likely approach China policy. And the report concluded with a series of policy recommendations for the incoming presidential administration. In this case, of course, it'll be a second Trump administration. So with those, with those housekeeping notes out of the way, we are all in for a treat today. I really just couldn't be more thrilled to have on board the three panelists we have, and I'm just going to say a few words about each of them, and then we'll dive right in. Elizabeth Economy of the Hoover Institution, up until very recently a senior advisor on China at the U.S. Department of Commerce, really one of the world's luminaries on thinking about the rise of China, U.S.-China relations, a prolific author, most recently of a book that I would commend to all of you, The World According to China. If you haven't already read it, put it on your reading list. We have Lili Pike, a reporter focusing on China at Foreign Policy magazine. Again, in terms of reading recommendations, I would really commend to all of you who are tuning in today an article that Lili published in September, on September 19th for Foreign Policy magazine, entitled How Does the U.S.-China Cold War End? And it was a deep dive analysis looking at some of the divides within the incoming Trump administration on China policy. And last but certainly not least, Yun Sun of the Stimson Center, also importantly an alum of the International Crisis Group, also really one of the world's luminaries thinking about these topics. And one last reading recommendation. This is an article by Yun entitled How China Would Tackle a Second Trump Term. This was published on the Brookings Institution's website on May 31st. And now we're going to dive right in. So we'll go till about 11:45 between the four of us, and then we'll go to questions from all of you. So a couple of questions by way of just kind of stock taking, scene setting. And Liz, maybe I'll begin with you. And of course, Lili and you and I want to come to the two of you as well. But Liz, let me start with you, since you, up until recently, as I said at the outset, you were working at the senior most levels of government, working on China policy. And so you have a proximity to these issues. The first stock-taking question or scene-setting question, as we approach the end of the Biden-Harris administration, where does the U.S.-China relationship stand, number one? And number two, how is today's China at home, abroad, how is today's China different from the China that Trump confronted 8 years earlier? So Liz, over to you, and then again, Lili and you, and I'll also want to bring you into the conversation, but Liz, over to you.
Thanks, Ali. And I have a reading list now, so I'm looking forward to after our call going and reading what everyone has written. So, okay, two big questions to start off. Let me start with the U.S. and then we'll see where we go with China. But I think where the U.S.-China relationship is today after the 4 years of the Biden administration. Look, I think the relationship is, I would call it 90% competitive and 10% cooperative. I think it reflects the really 180-degree change that we've seen over the past decade and a half, where the U.S. policy was all about engagement and cooperation was kind of the driving force. There was always conflict. There was always elements of competition. But overall, sort of the impulse in U.S. administrations was to seek to find common ground. I think that's changed. I think there's much less of a sense that that China's interested in finding common ground with us, and we're probably a little bit less interested in finding that common ground with what China would consider to be its sort of priorities and interests. So I think, for the first couple of years of the Biden administration, the idea was really to, as I think Secretary of State Blinken said early on, basically enable the United States to negotiate from a position of strength. And so an enormous amount of energy was put into, sort of investing at home with the Chips and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, which, helps with clean tech and with pharmaceuticals. Of course, Chips and Science is about bringing back innovation in manufacturing, advanced manufacturing around semiconductors, bipartisan infrastructure law, sort of ensuring that everybody has access to broadband. So really trying to make sure that the United States has the infrastructure, the technological infrastructure, and the manufacturing necessary to be able to compete with China for the rest of the 21st century. Second, of course, was the competition element, where I think a lot of work, and this is, commerce was quite central to this, a lot of work was put into trying to bolster and modernize our economic tools to protect our economic and national security. So export controls were enhanced, expanded. We have put in place, at least initially, ideas about outbound investment restrictions. We've long had inbound investment restrictions, but now outbound investment restrictions. I think supply chain work, because of COVID, I think the United States realized that it had too much of a reliance on, didn't want to be as reliant, obviously, on China. We saw the sort of challenge for our human security, being too reliant on China for PPE, but at the same time, even, being too reliant on Taiwan for semiconductors, right? We don't want to have a single point source over dependence on any country for something that is so critical to our human or national security. So really working with U.S. companies, with our allies and partners, to think through how to diversify our supply chains, how to make them more resilient. And then finally, that element of working with our allies and partners. And I think this was really central to the Biden administration strategy, was the notion that the United States simply cannot compete with China alone. Any export control that we would try to put in place, would be easily, very quickly undermined by a host of other countries who possess the same technology, unless we could bring them on board. And so there was a lot of effort put into establishing new institutions to align not only on export controls and things like outbound investment restrictions, but also working on supply chains, but thinking through things like AI governance. And so, we had the U.S.-EU Trade and Technology Council, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, we bolstered the Quad, AUKUS, put in place this sort of lattice framework for our defense. Everything sort of revolved around, or was rooted in, a sense of working with our allies and partners and putting in place the infrastructure for that partnership. And so I think, that was the bulk of the work for, I would say, the first 2.5 years. Then, there was an effort to, when we felt, I think, strong enough, right, there was an effort to reach out to China and to establish, sort of new channels of communication. Because I think the administration came to the realization that not having those kinds of discussions across an array of issues that matter to the United States actually did not serve U.S. interests. And so, the channels of communication were quite narrow. Really, we had Senator Kerry working on or Ambassador Kerry working on the climate change issue, and then we had Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken, conducting the discussions with Yang Jiechi and oh my gosh, Wang. I don't know, just a foreign minister. Anyway, so so I think that those were too narrow. And so, Commerce, Treasury, State expanded its writ. You started to have a lot of discussions across things like trade and investment, continuing on climate, reestablished a mill-to-mill channel. But these were really channels of communication, I would say, more than about cooperation. I think there was not a sense, for the most part, that we were going to end up with really significant elements of concrete cooperation. I think that did happen with fentanyl, but that would probably be the exception to the rule. So I think there was just this notion that we need to keep talking. Each side needs at least to understand the other side in order to prevent it from devolving into kinetic conflict. So I think, and I'll stop here because that was too long, and I think everybody's going to want to talk about the U.S. and then we can come to China. But I think for China, looking at the U.S. today, I think the biggest changes in the U.S. Number one, our economy is strong, very, low unemployment. Inflation is now back like to 2.5%. So looking good on that front too. So in a robust economy, allies and partners have probably never been stronger, at least in the past 8 to 10 years in terms of our relations and a range of issues that we work on together. And the U.S. is back in multilateral institutions, not so much WTO, but within the United Nations, right? Took the chair, the leading position in the International Telecommunications Union. That's another back in, UN Human Rights Commission where we, climate change, we're back. So I think that notion of US leadership on the global stage, I think was paramount within the Biden administration. So I think that's what I think China sees when it looks at the United States. And then I think it looks at what's coming and sees some pretty big opportunities, but I'll stop there.
Liz, terrific. And I started with you for a reason. I knew that just given, you were working on these issues at the senior most levels. And so you could really just kicking us off with the sense of your perspective from government. And I want to come to you next, and then Lili, turn to you. And then I also do want to come back to sort of the second part of that question about diving a little bit more deeply into just how today's China is different from the China that Trump confronted 8 years ago. But why don't you also as well give us a sense of your stock taking? Where is the U.S.-China relationship today as we approach the end of the Biden-Harris administration? Then Lili, I'll come to you, and then we'll talk a little bit about how today's China is different. But over to you.
Thank you, Ali. Well, great comments by Liz. In terms of where U.S.-China relationship is today, it's probably at the best place in the past 8 years, and probably the best place in the upcoming 8 years. That's the best summary that I can come up with. We have seen some major signs of stabilization of the relationship since 2023. And in 2024, there have been a number of, I would say, positive interactions, positive outcomes focused on cooperation on fentanyl, the resumption of mule-to-mule dialogues. So we have seen that today in 2020, this year in 2024, and I think a lot of the momentum probably will be put on a hold at a minimum, starting in January of 2025. And I think the Chinese are in a holding pattern. They are very much in a wait-and-see mode to see what Trump administration's hit on China will be. They anticipate that there will be pressure coming from Washington on multiple fronts, potentially on definitely on trade, potentially on the issue of Taiwan in South China Sea, and also in other security issues related to China's immediate periphery. So they see all these as potentials, right? One of the heatedly debated issue has been whether China's most favored nation status will be removed by the incoming Congress and be supported by the executive branch. So I think all those are uncertainties. If the Chinese have to take stock of the positives, they're probably very few. But we do see a number of indicators pointing towards personnel such as Elon Musk as potential emissaries or interlocutors between China and the Trump team. I think there have been so much attention focused on this prospect that I'm starting to question whether it is indeed viable, given the scrutiny and also the publicity that have been bestowed on it. So I think we are at a potentially at a very critical juncture in terms of U.S.-China relations. We know changes are going to come, that's for sure. But what will be the scale of the change and also the intensity, the velocity? I think all those remains to be seen. Thank you.
Yun, thank you so much. And so Lili, before I turn to you to sort of to take stock of the stock taking question, just sort of one pull quote from Liz's comments, and then one pull quote from Yun's comments, just to to anchor yours or to lay a context for you. So Liz's assessment that right now the U.S.-China relationship, it's probably 90% competitive and maybe sort of 10% the other category. And then Yun said the U.S.-China relationship right now, I'm paraphrasing, so my apologies, but the U.S.-China relationship is probably in the best place it has been in the past 8 years and likely the best place it'll be in the coming 8 years. So with those two kind of pull quotes, one from Liz, one from Yun, Lily, over to you to do a stock taking exercise for us.
Thanks so much, Ali. And I'd written both those quotes down myself. So excellent summaries from my fellow panelists. And I just wanted to take a moment before I dive in to thank Ali for an excellent report that I've used in my own reporting to kind of game out both the Harris and Trump scenarios. And now we're in the Trump scenario. So really looking forward to the conversation today. I think these summaries are very comprehensive. So I just have a couple things to add on the US side. I think one thing we haven't talked about yet is just the US involvement in these two major wars that are ongoing in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and how that will influence the ability of the US to engage with China diplomatically and to build a competitive strategy going forward. So I think that's just something to put on the table. And then just kind of looking back to where we were in 2016 when Trump first took office, I think a couple of things have definitely changed on the Chinese side, but on the US side, I think we can all say that there's been this growing consensus on the need to have a competitive approach to China. And Liz, talked about that at length, but kind of just the degree of this consensus. And today we'll talk about divergences built on that foundation. But I think it's worth pointing out that we do have a very solid foundation across both parties in terms of kind of the basic approach to China compared to 8 years ago.
Great, thanks, Lily, and thanks to you for, of course, mentioning these two major conflicts. And obviously, even though the United States is the world's preeminent power, even the world's preeminent power has limits to its time, to its bandwidth, to its resources, and so certainly it's going to have to make some difficult strategic choices in the years ahead. Liz, I'm going to come back to you for kind of a little bit of a deeper dive on the second part of that opening question about kind of how today's China is different. And I was reading an article the other day that talked about how China is working really redoubling its efforts to inoculate itself from economic pressure, not just from the United States, but I would say from the West more broadly. When the Trump administration first took office in early 2017. The president himself was something of a novelty in China. Some of his advisors were a novelty as well. The emphasis on tariffs again was kind of a shock to the system. China has obviously had 8 years to prepare, and now is looking to prepare for Trump 2.0. But China's domestic situation has undergone a number of changes in the past 8 years. China's external situation has undergone a number of changes in the past 8 years. So give us a little bit of a sense, maybe what are some of China's internal bright spots, if there are any? What are also some of the risks and challenges that China faces internally that maybe it didn't face as acutely 8 years ago? And then, turning your sights externally, so in the Indo-Pacific, but even, beyond the Indo-Pacific globally, how has China's external environment changed over the past 8 years? So Liz, maybe I'll turn to you, and then again, Yun, I'll come to you, and then Lily, I'll come to you.
Sure.
Liz,
so I think China is quite different. China is both domestically and on the global stage is quite different than it was 4 years ago, let's call it, or you want to say 8 years ago, either or. They're both. There's been a lot of change in the past 4 years. I mean, I think most notably, the relaxation of the zero COVID controls, huge. But I think significant for now is the fact, I think two things. Number one, that you haven't seen the economic rebound that people anticipated, right? Not only has it not been a sharp V, right? It hasn't even been a U in terms of an economic rebound. And I think we've watched as the Chinese leadership has struggled with, a set of, stimulus plans that, both Chinese economists, quite frankly, and Western economists evaluate as simply not enough, right? And not tackling the real structural issues that need to be tackled. And so even as the Chinese government says it's, growing at, I think most recent third quarter was 4.6%, but, they're aiming again for 5% growth. Groups like Rhodium say probably somewhere between 0 and 2%, really, right? And the IMF is forced to use, people make point of saying the IMF has, said that sort of supported China's claim, but the IMF uses Chinese statistics and Chinese data. So what the IMF says is not necessarily that relevant in many respects. So I think by all accounts, the Chinese economy is struggling. The property sector is still, lagging, still have very high youth unemployment, rising local debt. And even I think, though Xi Jinping is moving from saying we're going to do more in the construction sector, he's got some reforms in there, and let's move into advanced manufacturing. It's the same playbook. And so what I think you're going to see is simply local governments taking on more debt, right? You're going to get more waste, more inefficiency, and so the problem is going to perpetuate itself. So I think the economy is a little bit of a problematic place for China right now. That's not to say that they're not continuing to innovate, that they're not incredibly competitive across a range of technology sectors. I think it's really important to remember that, because, there's a whole narrative that's been developed in Washington over the past, I'd say, 6 months, that because China's economy is slowing, it's, taking a step back from its ambitions on the global stage, it's retrenching, and I don't see that. So I want to put that out there right now. We can maybe have a debate or a discussion about that. But I think it's true the economy is slowing, but I think there are still important areas where China is incredibly competitive, very innovative, and there's no time at which we should now take our foot off the gas pedal. So I think that's one big difference from where it was when certainly 8 years ago and even 4 years ago. I think a second big difference is that there's a lot more sort of dissatisfaction with the leadership of Xi Jinping, and I think you hear this certainly from Chinese colleagues, who are a little bit more open and willing to say that, they don't like the direction in which he's moving the country. So even Chinese colleagues that, maybe aren't your closest friends will say this. I think we see, signs of unhappiness burbling, and clearly we've seen, entire communities of expatriate Chinese forming in places like Tokyo and Washington, Amsterdam, liberal intellectuals, entrepreneurs, lawyers, basically establishing, I think, their own version of what they would like to see in China, right? A politically and economically reformed China, just happening in other countries. So I think that societal dissatisfaction, across gender, ethnic, I think there are many political cleavages and challenges that China faces. So I think domestically is more problematic than it was before. I think where China's made some gains is probably in bolstering the informal alliance with countries, with other authoritarian countries. Obviously, with Russia, Iran, North Korea, I think that sort of axis there is really demonstrating what it can do. In terms of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think without China, Iran, and North Korea, Russia would definitely not be in the position that it's in today. China is to some extent really helping to bankroll, Russia's war effort there. So I think that's that element. I think the world has become more polarized in that sense than it was before. I think China's also, with its, GDI, Global Development Initiative, Global Civilization Initiative, Global Security Initiative, it's put things out there, right? Sort of they're layered on top of the Belt and Road Initiative, 4 big initiatives that I think are designed to sort of transform the international system. And it's not that Xi Jinping has made enormous progress with any of these initiatives to date, but they're there. There's a push to de-dollarize the global economy. I think middle and emerging economies are attracted to elements of Xi Jinping's narrative. And so sort of the, part about not having, bloc alliances, obviously the de-dollarization, everybody use your own currency to trade and invest. I think countries, find this attractive. Every country determines, what its own people have in terms of, basic human rights. Forget about the universality of, individual rights. So I think there are a lot of countries that find that attractive, and China then becomes a pole position for them, right? China becomes the center around which they can all kind of revolve, or they gravitate towards. So I think there have been gains made in that respect as well. But I think, and I'll just stop here, I think conversely, the U.S., as I mentioned earlier, and its allies and partners, are working on more issues more closely than they ever have before, that are tied to pushing back against these kinds of changes that China would like to see in the world. So I think, simultaneous with China's, the growth of China's sort of role in the world, I think there's been an enhanced role for the United States and its allies and partners and a strengthening of that. So that's kind of where I see China. I think so. I do not see a pullback of China on the global stage. Just China's Belt and Road funding is back up to 2018 levels. I don't think it considers it to be a disaster, as some people in the United States have discussed.
Liz, that's terrific, and again, it's really thorough, and I think it's really textured as well. And I want to summarize, paraphrase your very rich summary, and then you and I want to turn over to you. So, my sense from Liz's comments is that domestically there are some bright spots. Certainly it seems that when it comes to technology, China is much more innovative. But if you look at some of more structural trends, youth unemployment, its rate of growth, it faces some very serious structural challenges. So innovating a lot more in technology, but also dealing with serious structural challenges. And then externally, in terms of bright spots, China is sort of, I think, gaining at least some succession, gaining some traction with this sort of triplet of initiatives: the security initiative, the development initiative, the civilization initiative, also the Belt and Road initiative. It's gaining some headway, but on the minus side from China's perspective, it also now faces a greater coalescence among kind of the world's leading industrial democracies, more so than it did in 2016. So at home, some bright spots, but also some challenges. Abroad, some bright spots, but also some challenges vis-a-vis 2016. Does that summary that Liz provided, does that track with what you're seeing when you think about China today vis-a-vis 2016? Yun, over to you.
Okay, sorry, I wasn't sure whether that's a question for me or for Liz. I agree with Liz. I think
I was going to say, I pretty much track with myself. So yeah, I do agree with myself. No problem there.
Yeah, it's just the summary. Well, I think there is a sense of hubris. We're seeing this more and more in the U.S. policy community, right, on China, that China's economy is slowing. There are more discontent within China, both within the elite politics, but also on the social level against the top leader. And the conclusion, and of course, there's also the argument that the Chinese economy has peaked. So we're looking at China on decline. But I think that's still very different from saying that China is on the edge of collapse. Because if you look historically, if there's a pattern that we can discern from all the dynastic changes in Chinese history, a dynasty usually peak within the first 3 to 4 leaders and then faces a long process of decline that could last from somewhere between 100 years to 300 years. Not saying that CCP on the same track, but I think the pattern we can argue is that a sudden death or a sudden immediate collapse of the CCP is not a realistic scenario that we can look for. This is not a short game. We're looking at a very long competitive process, what George China would call the test of national quality, both for US and for China. And we have seen Beijing showing the ability to adapt. And remember, people used to argue, I remember before December of 2022, people used to argue that, well, Xi Jinping cannot change. Xi Jinping will follow the policy of zero COVID till 2023 or 2024. And well, we saw that with social discontent, with people taking the street, we did see that Xi Jinping changed very abruptly, actually to the greatest surprise of many. So it does show that Xi Jinping has the ability to change. We're also seeing similar type of changes in terms of BRI, the type of funding that they give, and also the type of projects that they support. We're also seeing more recently a very abrupt change of position on India, that China have staged or have endured this deterioration of relations with India for the past 4.5 years since the Ladakh clash in 2020. But most recently, in late October, China suddenly announced that, well, all issues resolved, we're going to disengage. We're going to restore basically the pre-2020 status quo ante. And the question is, well, what did China have to gain from it? So Xi Jinping has the ability to change once he realizes that the cost of his policy significantly outweighs the benefits. So what does it mean coming to U.S.-China relations? I have three observations. The first one is that, well, compared to 2016 or even 2020, China is operating from a position of weakness. Is in a much weaker position economically and also in its relationship with the United States. They're having a voice in China, and I think that's quite a sensible judgment that the cost of trade war for China so far has significantly outweighed the cost of a trade deal. So I think there is a inner agreement or consensus in the Chinese society or in the Chinese elite politics that, well, if a trade deal can be reached with President Trump to pacify him, let's have a deal. Let's have a deal early on to prevent the tit for tat, to prevent the downward spiral. Let's try to have something positive in place for from the start this time around. Well, there are difficulties for that approach because well, Trump may not find a deal China is willing to accept acceptable on his part, and in many of the policy discussions that I see in the Chinese context, the Chinese can let President Trump have a win, but they cannot take the humiliation. They cannot afford having Trump win in a trade deal and still comes back and rub it on the Chinese face and say, well, look at how great I am, and Chinese leader is nothing compared to my great leadership. I think that's something that the Chinese bureaucracy even find impossible to accept. Which goes to my second observation in terms of China vis-a-vis Trump, which is compared to 2017, I think the Chinese this time around, they're much better prepared. Not that they are prepared, but they are better prepared compared to 2017. In 2017, they did not know what they were looking at. They were still of the view that U.S.-China relationship has a floor, but there also is a ceiling. There's a ceiling, but there is also a floor. What happened in the following 4 years basically showed the Chinese there might be a ceiling, but there can be no floor. But I think this time around, we're seeing the Chinese have made preparations, or they have prepared themselves mentally and materially in terms of what the worst case scenario might look like. It doesn't mean that they're looking forward to it, but I think when we look at the dual circulation the Chinese government has proposed, we look at how the Beijing has tried to tie up the loose end on local debts in the recent weeks. And also look at how China is shifting, or gradually shifting its focus in terms of export from global north to global south. We are seeing the steps that China is taking or has been taking to prepare for another Trump administration. So they're more prepared. That doesn't mean that they're fully prepared. Nobody can. But there have been more preparation in this regard. And the third observation I have is that, well, this time around, when you look at the Chinese narrative about President Trump and his administration, the flavor, the texture is very different from 2017. In 2017, we saw the Chinese narrative basically laugh at U.S. democracy as a joke, right? Laugh at President Trump as a joke. And I think that level of almost a lack of seriousness in dealing with the Trump administration plagued the Chinese decision-making during the first Trump term. But this time around, I think the Chinese are much more serious about Trump's strong political mandate here in the United States, the popular support that he enjoys, and also the policy that he will craft from a much more professional team compared to the first term. So these are the distinctions I see the Chinese are making about U.S.-China relations compared to 8 years ago. We'll see how things will evolve because much of it depends on the interaction rather than the unilateral action by either side. Thank you.
Yun, that was terrific. And actually, it's a perfect segue, Lili. I want to come to you. And I want to ask, I kind of want you to pick up where you just sort of left off in terms of vis-a-vis when the first Trump administration took office in January 2017 versus now. The team that President-elect Trump is assembling, and the article that I mentioned at the outset was basically your sort of deep dive. It was obviously before the election had taken place, but already you had done a lot of thinking about looking at some of the advisors whose names were being floated, who potentially might go into a second Trump administration. So maybe talk to us a little bit for folks who haven't read that article. I hope all of you on the call, I hope that you will read that article. But if you haven't, for folks who haven't, talk to us a little bit about the key findings from that article, and then picking up where Yun left off. Tell us a little bit about, based on your reporting and the conversations you're having, what is President-elect Trump's theory of the case when it comes to China? What is he hoping to accomplish over the next 4 years vis-a-vis China? And based on the appointments he's made thus far, what do those appointments tell us about how he's thinking about China policy in a second Trump term? So Lili, over to you, and then maybe Liz, I'll come to you, and then you afterward. But Lili, over to you, please.
Great, thanks, Ali. So going back to my article, this was, reporting ended over the summer, so we still didn't have a full picture of, first of all, Trump winning the election or who he'd be populating his, cabinet with. But at that time, basically, the motivation for doing the reporting was looking at this debate playing out in Washington over whether the end goal for U.S. China competition should be changing the Chinese government structure. And that debate had been playing out for a number of months, even a couple of years going back. But the article really traces a couple different camps within the Republican world surrounding Trump. And I do basically, in the article, note a couple main fissures where you have a couple key members of the Republican kind of China expert world that see the U.S. China competition more in the terms of a new Cold War, and believe it's ideological and believe that it is existential. So that's one camp, just kind of broadly summarizing. And then you have another camp that is more restraint focused, more oriented towards maintaining balance of power, kind of roughly equivalent to today, maybe bolstering military support for Taiwan and in the region, but stopping short of launching a full, even fuller than today, competition with China in terms of kind of gearing up for an existential clash. So those are kind of the two main camps that I focus on in that article. Now, kind of fast forwarding to today, a number of the people I focus on in the article, including Matt Pottinger and Bridge Colby, we still don't know where they'll be in the administration, if they'll be in the administration at all. However, I think we can still kind of think about the potential fissures or fault lines that we're seeing from the names that we have so far. So, I think one of the key names we'll talk about is Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. And he's one of the key congressional China hawks going back many years. He takes the Cold War approach to China, has traditionally had a very strong position on competition with China, a very strong position on human rights in China, including co-authoring the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, and also bills on Hong Kong, for which he was sanctioned in 2020. So looking at his profile, I think we see somebody who's very prepared to take a very comprehensive approach to competition with China. On the other hand, I think you already previewed this, but we have names including Elon Musk, who will be, actually staffed in the administration now, we know, in the new efficiency department. And this is all speculation so far, as far as I can tell, but we know that he has these strong business interests in China. We know that he came out in the spring, actually, against tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles coming into the US. And so in a number of ways, we see that he runs counter to other members of the Trump administration, and certainly Trump himself, on some key policy issues. So I'll be very curious to see going forward if he does play any role in mitigating the Trump policy, and also whether other voices that are more restraint-oriented and not as invested in a full-out competition with China become kind of key members of the administration. And so we might see sort of, I think, at least two main camps there, and then potentially a third if we see more kind of Wall Street traditional appointees joining the administration, and also maybe pushing for more kind of a continued economic engagement with China. So those are kind of the main camps or fissures I'm seeing as of now, but I'm sure there are many other appointees and different fault lines that I haven't mentioned yet.
Lili, great, and a really sort of nice kind of demarcation of the if not the actual camps, but what seem to be sort of some of the emerging camps. Liz, let me come to you. Obviously, you just recently came out of government, and you obviously are tracking very closely sort of which folks are going into the second Trump administration, which other names are being floated. Does Lili's kind of analysis, kind of this maybe kind of a team of rivals, potential team of rivals dynamic, does that sort of map onto what you're seeing? What is sort of your initial assessment of how the second Trump administration is shaping up potentially when it comes to China policy?
I would say it's possible that there's a team of rivals, sort of playing out here, but I don't think it actually matters very much. I think, Yun, I think I heard you say you thought that this group of appointees was more professional than Trump's first cabinet. I don't know if that's what you meant to say, but I'm not sure I would agree with that right at the outset. What I think distinguishes this group that Trump has selected is that I don't see a single person in there that is likely to challenge what President Trump says. There's no Secretary Mattis, as far as I can tell, right, in this group. There's no H.R. McMaster. There's no Kelly. I don't see those big figures with sort of independent senses of self and sort of strong policy chops. I think Marco Rubio could have been a person like that. I mean, he's, I think, much more internationalist than President Trump is by his nature. And I think Lili describes him accurately as being someone he's, strong on democracy and values, which is also something President Trump has never demonstrated any interest in. But if we've watched, Senator Rubio over the past 6 or so months, as I'm sure you have, we've seen him take a step back from what has been his very traditional sorts of positions. And so my feeling is that people are going to fall in line with the overall direction of President Trump's policies. Where he is uncertain, and I don't know where that might be, but where he's uncertain, there's probably some room for debate, discussion, and influence to play out. But I mean, think about Elon Musk and Tesla's. I don't think Tesla actually exports cars to the United States from China. Does it? I think it exports those cars to the EU, but I think it doesn't have those. So at some level, I mean, Elon Musk may know that 60% tariffs, yes, will cause, China to have to divert perhaps as much as $200 billion worth of exports elsewhere. So to that point, you and I would say, I probably disagree with you a little bit. I mean, you were careful to say that China was prepared, not fully prepared. I would say they're in the process of preparing, but nowhere near where they need to be prepared if actually President Trump put 60% tariffs on all Chinese goods coming into the U.S. It's impossible for them to prepare for that. Dual circulation does not take them. They have not made enough progress there. So in any case, I think my feeling is that the person that matters is President Trump. And I think his focus is on the U.S. economy. And whatever serves the interests of the U.S. economy is what he believes will serve the interests of the U.S. economy is where he's going to go. And that means tariffs. If that means welcoming Chinese investment into the United States, which is another policy that runs contrary to a lot of members of Congress, a lot of governors, that's not the direction in which the U.S. has been moving over the past, 4 to 6 years. But, he has said that as long as they manufacture here, why do we care? Talked about, the not going to ban TikTok. That's something else where there'd be, strong disagreement from people like Elise Stefanik and Marco Rubio and others. Are they really going to step up and push back against President Trump and cause him to change his mind? I don't think so. Unless there's some particularly compelling piece of evidence that they have. President Trump has said, no difference between, TikTok and Facebook, right? So I think there's going to be a lot of I think President Trump feels extremely empowered, and I don't think he actually feels like he needs to listen to anyone. And I think he's put in place people who definitely have strong views, but it's very far from clear to me that those views are actually going to matter much.
So just to wrap up the first part of our conversation, because we have a number of questions, not surprisingly, that have come in. Let me get you to just respond directly to what Liz said. So my sense from Liz's comments is that yes, we know now the names of a number of appointees. Some of them have different views. That really, Trump is kingmaker, and if Trump decides I want to take China policy in this direction, the officials he's bringing on board, they will have to go along with what he says. But so maybe if I could get you to respond to Liz, and then we'll turn over to some questions from the audience. But Yun, over to you.
Sure. When I was talking about professional, I'm more leaning towards the actual experience on China policy, actual knowledge, and the record of working on issues related to China, to have a systematic understanding of the threats that China presents. I think on that we see, at least I see, maybe I see this by mistake, that people that have been selected have more experience in this regard compared to some of the personnel during the first term. Whether being a Trump loyalist defeats the goal of being a professional, I think that's a separate question. But I think to be an effective policymaker on China, knowledge about China and the past experience working on China is indispensable. In terms of the question on China's preparation, I think there's this very sober recognition that no one can be prepared. Because, well, how do you prepare for 60% of tariff on all of your export to one of your largest trading partners, right? You can't really prepare for it. You can only take the trauma and try to hope that there could be something done preventatively or preemptively to prevent it from happening. But I think the worst case scenario is very real for the Chinese policymakers, and there is no way to prepare for it. They can only prepare to deal with the trauma. And I think that goes to the mentality that or the question, what is the worst case scenario that can come? Okay, well, some of the calculations says that, well, if the 60% of tariff is indeed imposed, it will cost China about 3% of its GDP growth, which will set back the Chinese economic growth probably to negative, if we use a real number. But does China have an option? What is the alternative? If there is no alternative and there's no better policy option, they have to take it as it happens. I feel to prepare as at best as they could is the only policy possibility ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, can I just say one thing, Ollie? I think
please. Yes.
The point that you made, which was really interesting to me, Yun, that the Chinese are talking about trying to put together a kind of a trade deal again. I'd love to see like who's talking about that and what they think that trade deal could look like. I mean, I think one of the things that's been in the back of my mind is whether President Trump, if the Chinese came to him with some very attractive, and I don't even know what that would include exactly at this point, because if you really stop to think about things, we've also been in the business of trying to move supply chains away from China, not become too reliant on China. But okay, let's put that aside and assume there's some kind of trade deal to be had. It's been in the back of my mind that President Trump could say, 20 or 30% tariffs right off the bat. The other, 30 to 40% we're willing to negotiate on. Let me see what you bring to the table. And he could also make the case potentially that it's the Biden administration's fault that the Chinese didn't fulfill the trade agreement, right? That things really fell apart in the Biden administration. It wasn't his fault. I'm just, in my imagination here, trying to sketch out a scenario that would make it face-saving for him to do what I think you're suggesting the Chinese might be thinking about, which is to try to, forestall some of the sort of worst, worst scenarios from China's perspective, from actually coming to be. And I mean, it's also true that, very few real economists in the United States think that this is a good policy. And I know that some very serious Republican economists have been trying to talk to prospective secretaries of the Treasury and tell them, please, this does not help, the U.S. economy, right? Does not help U.S. consumers. And can you get that message to President Trump? So I think there will be a lot of voices coming in on President Trump around this. Whether or not they have any impact, I think, remains to be seen. But anyway, I just wanted to say I could see some possibility of a trade deal, but I think he's going to be hard pressed not to put any tariffs on China at this point, because that's all he's been talking about.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Liz. So we have about 25 minutes left. We have a number of questions that have already come in, but for folks, if you have a question that has come to mind, or something that you've been wanting to put on the table, please do just use the Q&A function that you should see on your Zoom screen, and I'll try to get to as many questions as I can. So a number of questions that have come in on climate, and I really, anyone who wants to begin on these questions, feel free. But so a number of questions, and I'll try to group them on climate change. One, it looks like it seems certain that a second Trump administration would again withdraw us from the Paris Climate Accord, and so questions on what if any are the prospects for cooperation on climate change between the United States and China in a second Trump administration, and if the second Trump administration indeed goes through and withdraws from the Paris Climate Accord again, what is the impact on China's influence over just sort of the non-carbon part of the global economy? So I don't know if any of our three esteemed panelists has a strong view, but Lili, I saw you. I'm going to interpret you lifted a finger. I'll interpret that as a hand raise. So Lili, why don't we go to you, and then and Yun and Liz, if you want to come in as well. But Lili, over to you.
Well, I'm sure Liz and Yun probably have more to say on this, but it's just to start us off. I think when we look at the future of U.S. China climate cooperation under the second Trump term, it seems pretty bleak to me if we look back at the first term experience. And I know at that time there were still some Department of Energy programs that kept running for a couple of years through the Trump administration. So there's a question of how much of the cooperation, at this point, very little of that has continued through the Biden administration. But if there are programs that can keep kind of running quietly, we saw that in the first term. But as Liz and you mentioned at the beginning, in terms of the climate cooperation, it's been fairly limited, even during the Biden administration. And the focus has been mostly on communication, trying to create transparency for China in terms of its climate commitments, and creating shared priorities for both sides, whether that's methane or other non-CO2 greenhouse gases. So I imagine that all of those working groups immediately will kind of cease to exist, and certainly there will not be the kind of same level of communication at all. And I think like the only thing that I can imagine really going forward is what we saw before too, in terms of non-state actors, looking at subnational cooperation between provinces in China and states, kind of lead climate states like California. In the U.S., we saw Gavin Newsom, travel to China and create these provincial level agreements. So can imagine that going forward and still being significant as those provinces in China create their own plans to meet the Shuangtan goals of 2030 peaking and 2060 carbon neutrality. But I'm curious to see kind of how the America First investment domestically under Trump will apply or not apply to the clean energy industries, because at one point, Trump actually said that he welcomed Chinese investment in EV factories in the U.S., and then he reversed on that at the end of the campaign. And so, I'm curious to see if any Chinese factories will be welcomed, but I'll kick it over to others if they have more to say on that.
I agree with everything that Lili said. I think, given the U.S., I think the Biden administration, the greatest sort of success that it had was the methane agreement. And that came about as much from U.S. China talking to each other as the U.S. bringing a lot of other countries in and, bringing pressure to bear on China as well. And so I think that element of U.S. strategy of U.S. leadership is clearly gone in a Trump administration, I think, as Lili was saying. But I do think that, yes, states like California will continue to do climate-related, partnerships. And I think it's also important, the climate cooperation today is very different from, what Hank Paulson was trying to undertake, decades ago with the original sort of strategic and economic dialogue, where we were talking about transferring technology to China at below market prices and things like this. That's not what climate cooperation is about. I mean, sure, there's still talk about doing stuff in third countries. I imagine that's not going to happen driven out of Washington anyway. It could happen, I suppose, at the state level with some companies. I think for me, and I think Lili has also really pointed to this, what is almost more important, frankly, is what the U.S. does, domestically and for our own climate participation. I think, China has its targets. The Europeans will call China out if they don't, meet their targets. We need to be focused on what we're going to be doing with our own clean energy industry. And I did notice the CEO of ExxonMobil calling out, don't pull us out of Paris climate. I'm hopeful, maybe unrealistically so, that American companies who've, really made the transition in many respects and see, clean tech as, not only the sort of, important for climate change, but as an industry of the 21st century, that they're going to continue no matter what the Trump administration does in terms of deregulation and, for oil and, fossil fuels and the, moribund coal industry.
Yun, over to you.
I don't have a lot to add. I think first it depends on how much of a priority the Trump administration will treat the climate change agenda, right? That's always a precondition for China to treat it seriously in terms of the interaction with the United States. The second observation I have is really about the technicality of the climate change negotiation between U.S. and China. We know that the Chinese special envoy, former Chinese special envoy Xie Zhenhua retired earlier this year. John Kerry also retired. So we have Liu Zhenming, who was a Chinese diplomat without much of a climate change or industry background, leading the climate change work at the Ministry of, I believe, Ecology and Environmental Protection. So for the two teams to come together and be on the same page and have a conversation, a negotiation about climate change, it will require, first, I would say, the professionalism, the knowledge of the teams, especially the team leads themselves. And two, it also requires the two teams to develop the familiarity with each other so that they can have an in-depth conversation, meaningful conversation. And I think that's what people saw with Xie Zhenhua and John Kerry in terms of their interaction. They were both experienced, they know each other well, the two teams knew each other well, but now we don't have that anymore. And with the incoming Trump administration, I think it's more likely that the two teams or the leads of the two teams will be even less familiar with each other and also with the issue and the negotiation as it stands. So I think there will be some major uphill on this particular issue. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Yun. Several questions are pouring in now, so I'm going to try, especially since we have just about 15 minutes left, I'm going to try to sort of group them into categories. Two questions that kind of get at sort of China's capacity to engage in economic retaliation. So let me just spell them out briefly, and then whichever of our esteemed panelists would like to begin, please do. So one question, essentially, what impact will a second Trump administration have on China's efforts to internationalize its currency and pursue further de-dollarization? I know that de-dollarization has already come up a little bit in our conversation. And then relatedly, we've had a lot of discussion about the impact of, if it looks like the second Trump administration will indeed perceive 60% tariffs, what the impact would be on China. But we have a question looking at China's capacity to engage in retaliation, perhaps weaponize its position in certain global supply chains, and also relatedly, if the Trump administration is imposing tariffs not only on China, but also sort of more broadly, what could be some of the boomerang consequences for U.S. consumers and companies? So again, it's broadly impact of a second Trump administration on China's efforts to internationalize its currency and pursue de-dollarization, and what are some of the instruments that China might have at its disposal to engage in economic retaliation? Anyone who wants to take a crack? Liz, I'm going to look at you because you were working at Commerce.
I can I'll try to be brief, very brief. I would say on the de-dollarization, Trump has said that he will tariff countries. He'll place tariffs on countries that move away from using the dollar. I mean, at this point, tariff is basically the answer to everything, and I don't even know whether to take that seriously. But that is at least preliminarily the President Trump's response to the de-dollarization effort by Beijing. Does China? I think this is something that I probably should have mentioned in terms of where China has gotten stronger for sure in its retaliatory toolbox. And I think it always had economic coercion, but we've seen now over the past 6 to 9 months, that it has developed the capacity really to hit back, with restrictions on licensing restrictions on gallium and germanium and antimony, and so I think the fact that China controls so much of the mining in the world, but even more of the processing, I think is something that they could definitely use to their advantage in the face of the tariffs. And whatever the weaponization basically of trade, I think China is in a much better position. I think not necessarily for their economy to take it, but in order to retaliate, I think they're in a stronger position. Before, I think they would just thought about tariffs, and I'm sure they will do some of that too potentially. But I think this is the other big thing that they have now at their disposal. And then the implications. What was the last part of the question, Ali?
Yeah, so just I think.
The implication if Trump tariffs everybody.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, my concern is that would provide an opening for China to basically say the United States is an unreliable trade partner, and to really try to make headway in terms of picking off our allies and partners, and basically just make the case that we should establish our own trading regime, right? In any case, the U.S. isn't playing in the WTO very well right now, and so saying right, well, we have to deal with the United States, but I think moving forward, let's think about how we all can work together and establish a trading regime that's not subject to the United States weaponization of trade.
Thanks very much, Liz. Lili, I saw you had your hand raised. Please go ahead.
Yeah, just to quickly follow up on that, I think just looking at European responses to the tariffs that Trump has threatened to, I've just heard that that would force Europe to then increase trade with China again and kind of move away from the kind of growing unity that we've seen between the European Union and the U.S. approach to China. And so I think we could see a reversal there if Trump does, in fact, increase tariffs on European countries. And then just on Liz's point about kind of China's leverage of critical minerals, I know that the Trump administration first identified critical minerals as a main area of concern, but just to point out that we are still in a very vulnerable position in the U.S. in terms of those supply chains, and as Liz said, it's definitely a point of leverage.
Yoon, any thoughts?
Well, a couple of thoughts. First,
Please.
on the de-dollarization, well, we saw China expediting is, for example, local currency transaction with Russia since the beginning of the Ukraine war. We've seen the Shanghai Cooperation Organization talking about their own SWIFT system and their transaction system. I think there are some major internal obstacles to work out in terms of who will be leading it, who will be supporting it, who will be staffing it. But there are more conversations in this regard. Earlier on, there was a discussion about China and Saudi using local currency for their oil transaction. I don't think Saudi Arabia will be taking that deal anytime soon. But I still think that the globalization of the Chinese currency, the constraint to it lies from within, right? It is China's capital control, China's control over the foreign exchange rate. I think that is a much bigger obstacle for the globalization of RMB. But de-dollarization, that's a separate issue. In terms of the Chinese capacity to retaliate, I agree with Liz. I think there will be some tariff, but just given the size of the trade imbalance, the Chinese simply don't have that much U.S. export to China to impose tariff on, right? So I think they learned this lesson very much in 2018 when they realized that, oops, we actually don't have that much with U.S. in order to impose an equivalent or a comparable tariff on U.S. export. I agree with Liz that there are more thinking or preparation about the weaponization of some of the elements of the supply chain. Although I have to question that what is the effectiveness of the weaponization, right? I haven't done the research on gallium and germanium since the Chinese imposed export restriction, I believe, last year. But if you think about the earlier example of China's export control on rare earth elements to Japan, the result of that, one, arbitrage, two, smuggling of the Chinese rare earth elements from domestic market to international market, because the domestic production capacity is still there, while the export has been removed artificially by the government. So what that creates is massive smuggling, illegal transactions of the rare earth elements, which led to, I believe if my memory is correct, within, I believe, 4 to 5 years, the Chinese market share on the global rare earth market fell from 96% to 70%. So it just created incentive for Japan to diversify the sources of its rare earth elements. So I think it's even a debate in the Chinese policy community whether that was a successful strategy and it achieved the goals that it aimed to achieve. But then if the goal is just to pose a retaliation, to present an image that China is not out of resort in terms of response, I think, yeah, sure. But coming to the real effectiveness, I think is still very much is a question. The impact of tariff on a broader audience and spectrum. Well, look, I think the issue essentially is that are we adopting a coalition-based strategy to counter China's rise, or this is a unilateral strategy, right? Do we throw the baby out with the bathwater? Do we treat trade as an overriding priority across the board with every single country? Or we also see some of these countries are actually important partners in our competition with China. Therefore, we need to strike some level of balance between these two agenda. I don't see a clarification on this direction yet. Hopefully, there will be some clarity emerging down the road. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Yun. And your closing comment just now is actually a perfect segue to a couple of questions that I wanted to get to. So I'm just going to group them again. And I'm going to try to get sort of two big questions in our last 8 or 9 minutes here. So a couple of questions that have come in on, again, just some of the broader geopolitical impacts of a second Trump administration. So one questioner asking, what impact, and I think, Lili, you were kind of getting at this with some of your remarks, what impact will the second Trump administration have on China's relationships with the European Union? And then relatedly, and albeit in a different theater, what impact will the second Trump administration have on America's role in Asia, given, I think, the incoming president's so-called America First worldview? So impact on China-Europe relations, impact on America's role in Asia. So who would like to kick us off? Lili, why don't I go with you first? Liz, I'll come to you, and then you, and if you have some thoughts. But Lili, why don't I come to you first?
Sure. Yeah, I think I basically already said what I have to say on Europe and kind of how trade would potentially drive a wedge between the U.S. and Europe on China. So that's kind of more or less how I see that playing out. But on the Asia side, I think it's interesting when talking to people in Trump's orbit. Trump is often characterized as an isolationist, as anti-alliance, but I think that's not entirely correct. It's the term is burden sharing, trying to push for better deals with allies in terms of the way that the U.S. military bases operate and the amount of cost sharing for those bases. And so I can see, already we saw the news this week about Taiwan trying to potentially broker some large weapons sale with the incoming Trump administration to try to create, a better kind of just footing for the relationship going into the new term. So I can imagine a lot of those kinds of deals playing out with allies in the region to try to kind of get ahead of any wrath from the Trump administration. I think what we don't see as much typically, in terms of the Trump thinking, is the focus on kind of broader multilateral alliances, more of a kind of orientation toward bilateral deal making. And so I think that certainly will have an impact when we look at all the work that the Biden administration has done to build up these kind of mini laterals to support U.S. defense and kind of just general diplomacy in the wider region. So, yeah.
Great.
I
Liz.
guess I would say I think it'll take a strong, push by, those the internationalists in the Trump administration, like Marco Rubio, finds his footing to keep things like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and the U.S.-EU, Trade and Technology Council. I think there will be less movement away on the defense side. That would be my guess. I mean, one of the things with President Trump is that he did preside over a huge increase in defense spending during his first term, by $100 billion, despite constantly, talking about, how much money they spend and sort of the terrible military industrial complex and everything. That is what happened in the end. So, depending on how strong the new Secretary of Defense is and maybe that sort of element of all of the work, on AUKUS and all the mini laterals on the defense side will continue. I guess one interesting thing that a former senior Trump official said to me is, it's not that Trump loves dictators. It's that he loves strong leaders. He likes leaders who can deliver. And so given that, you could imagine maybe that somebody like Maloney in Italy, or, that there may be some new partnerships that could emerge with leaders that have authoritarian leanings, or, so maybe he can find new partners one-on-one. And we did have a good, the Quad was strengthened in the first go round. I attribute that, though, to sort of that second tier of actually Rex Tillerson and Secretary Mattis, and then HR, Matt Pottinger, all those people pushed forward on a much more internationalist, U.S. leading kind of role in Asia. And I don't know whether President Trump fully backed it or just wasn't paying attention to it, So I don't know the answer to whether or not he'll come in with a sense of wanting to continue that thrust or not. But I could see that, that could be a possibility, that part of the U.S. Foreign policy will not, sort of disintegrate in the next 100 days.
Great. Thanks, Liz. Yun, over to you, and then I'm going to see if we can do a lightning round on one more question. Yun, over to you.
Okay. Well, I see some similarity between these two questions. The question basically is that how U.S. approach to our allies and our partners is going to affect China's relationship with them and also our relationship with them. Again, I think it's still unclear as for what the administration's policy on this particular issue will look like. We know that Trump has announced that he wants to end the Ukraine war. Well, how is the ending will be negotiated, or what it will look like? Does Ukraine have to be the complete victim in the ending of the war, or there will be some provisions be made? I think all those are unclear just yet. It very much depends on U.S. approach. I think for Biden administration, one of the top achievements is that how U.S. was able to coalesce to build this global coalition vis-a-vis China, right? Are we going to preserve that? I think that's an essential question. I think this comment about Trump's preference for strong leaders is going to have a very interesting impact, or raise an interesting question in terms of U.S.-Russia relations, right? There are people talking about the U.S. China's Russia's strategic triangle. How is that going to evolve? I don't know how U.S. will look at this issue, but I know on the Chinese side, this is actually a top Chinese concern, that there will be some sort of rapprochement or some sort of stabilization of U.S.-Russia relations which will directly undermine Russia's incentive to align closely with China. I think there is a fear in the Chinese policy community that this is going to happen. In fact, in 2017, this element of U.S.-Russia rapprochement was listed as a top national or global security risk, or the top wild card for China's external strategy after Trump became the president. So I think that question is something that's not directly related to our partners or our allies, but it's about how U.S. grand strategy will be crafted in this regard. Thank you.
Yun, thank you very much. So we are at time, but I promised I was going to do a lightning round on one question. So if you could answer the question and then also sort of weave in kind of any closing kernels of wisdom for our audience, try to do so in just a few seconds. And I'll just go Liz, Lili, and then you'll get the last word. So the last question is, I think a lot of speculation over what a second Trump administration is going to do, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of potential unpredictability. So I think a lot of folks are trying to think about what clues, what signals, what noise should they be trying to monitor to get some sense of how a second Trump administration might approach China policy based on developments in this transition period. So for folks who are kind of trying to make sense of what's ahead, what signals, what signposts, what metrics should they be thinking about over the next couple of months to help them make sense of what is to come? So Liz, let me start with you. Lili, we'll turn to you, and then you'll get the last word. Liz, over to you.
So I think I already answered earlier. I think what you need to look at is what President Trump is saying, and I think it's like we're in Xi Jinping land. I think what matters is what Xi Jinping says, what he writes. I think the same is going to be true of the Trump administration. And just on Yun's last point, since you said I could weave something in, I think the Chinese should not be that worried about a U.S.-Russia rapprochement, because fundamentally what Russia wants in this world is much closer to what China wants and not to what the U.S. wants.
Thanks, Liz. Lili, over to you.
I think that was a great quote from Liz there. I'll be remembering that going forward as I do my reporting. Well, I will just make a plug for my fantastic team at Foreign Policy. We're running a blog throughout the transition where we'll be putting up updates on personnel and what that means. And I think Liz is definitely right that the person to watch is first and foremost Trump and what he says, and we need to study all that closely because it will have huge implications. But I do think, just looking back to the first term, we did see this kind of second level within the administration in which, especially on China, there were policies that were playing out that Trump, may not have been directly aware of or guiding as much. And so I'll be really curious to see, once we have the full China team, national security team in place, what kind of the balance of worldviews looks like. And I do think that will at least inform the broader China strategy, even if ultimately the major calls are definitely made by Trump himself.
Lili, thank you very much. Yun, you get the last word, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, if the first Trump term serves as some references, President Trump is not going to leave us guessing. I think his policy will be very clear, will be very out there. Just need to look at what policy moves and decisions and announcements that comes out of the White House and out of the Trump administration. And I think Lili is pointing to something that's incredibly important here, which is a second tier effect within the Trump team, right? During the first term, we saw internal competitions, we saw inconsistencies, we saw that different power centers or different positions had different approaches. So this time around, I think the people are all very much Trump loyalists. They're on the same page on this particular issue, but I suspect that on policy formulation and implementation, we're still going to see some variations, some differences among different people and different key officials. So I think that will be very interesting to watch as well. Thank you.
Well, Yun, thank you very much. With apologies for taking us a few minutes beyond our 12:15 stop, but I think you see why. I think you saw why we were so lucky to have the three panelists we did. Just an incredibly rich, wide-ranging, stimulating conversation. So For all of for the folks in attendance, virtually, if you could give a round of applause. Elizabeth Economy, Lili Pike, Yunsun, thank you so much for a terrific conversation. I couldn't have asked for a better panel. I've jotted down tons and tons of pages of notes, which I will be referencing. For all of those in attendance, again, the report that the crisis group published, the next U.S. administration in China policy, it's available in full on our website. So please give it a read if you haven't already. Please join me again in thanking our panelists. And I suspect that we will be having many more of these conversations in the weeks and months ahead. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a good rest of your day. Take care.
Thanks, Ali.
Thank you.